something like 68%, 67% of the population voted for the Constitution, and we did not vote for clauses in the Constitution. We voted for the entire Constitution. The first and most important chapter of that was Chapter 6. There was Article 10 that you've spoken about. Kenyans did not vote for the Constitution blindly. They knew that there were articles that would raise the level of leadership integrity. So we really wished that the 8 clauses in Chapter 6 would be implemented. And we wanted, a leadership culture that would respect the people, that would respect public office, that would bring honor to the positions of public office. And once again, 68% voted for that Constitution. That is 6 million people out of 8 million people. It's about the same number of people who voted for the current president of the Republic of Kenya, right? So if the Constitution was a president, that would be the president that we'd have voted in back in 2010. The second thing I think that's critical is really to look beyond Kenyans to their levels of mistrust for politicians and public officers. I think that is where the level of disappointment is. So it is not that Kenyans do not value integrity, it's just that they do not see integrity in the places in which they wanted to see them. And essentially those were public officers, state officers, and all the examples I think that Honorable Mwara has spoken about are great examples of how we have allowed essentially state capture to take place. Kenyans value integrity, they just don't value state capture. The third argument relates to the issues of the lack of role models. So many, Kenyans are literally, like the biblical phrase, are wandering in the darkness, in the wilderness, because they do not have role models that essentially imbibe and express the kind of constitutional values that we've just talked about. We see sports people doping. We see tax avoidance. Something like 9 out of 10 companies didn't pay all the taxes they should have paid last year. We've seen absentee parents, fathers who don't come home, who don't provide for their children. And we have seen a raft of ghost workers. Now, I'm sure my opponent will argue that this is an example of how Kenyans don't value integrity. But I would argue that no, it isn't. It is a small number of people. Just to give you an example. He talked about, dropouts, university dropouts. Let's not forget that 3.5 children go to school every year. They are funded by their parents or by sponsors, and essentially it is considered it is considered to be parental to take your children to school still. If we were to go with the argument that actually the dropouts are the standard, then actually the 3.5 million students would not be in school. Right? The bulk of our population essentially understand the value of education and the importance of education for career progression. There are 2 other arguments. The first of the 2 arguments are essentially that public participation, a core element in our constitution, in our policies and our procedures, not just at the national government level, but at the county level, have been deliberately strangled or suffocated. The lack of ownership, the lack of inclusion, the lack of expression, that essentially is where we need to look to understand why the levels of corruption are so high. It is not that Kenyans do not value integrity. It is that they are profoundly disappointed by the lack of opportunity to engage in public affairs. Public participation was strangled, and therefore, what is left for Kenyans except to be mistrustful of government? And the last point is this, essentially. My opponent has spoken a bit about the leaders that are revered, the politicians that get elected primarily because they have stolen rather than they have safeguarded public service. It is not true. 60% of our politicians are rejected at the polls every electoral cycle, right? 60%. What does that tell us? It tells us that actually those people who are still voting, and let's be clear, 18 million people did not vote for the current national government, right? 18 people said that they did not feel convinced that this government is the government that they would put their support around. So I think it's really important to come to the last point succinctly, which is to say, it is not corrupt leaders that we revere, it is ethical leaders. There is no leader that has stolen that has the stature of a Desmond Tutu, of a Nelson Mandela. Even Kibaki, in the last couple of years, the one thing that we remembered about him was essentially that he presided over an effective state. There was workability under his leadership. And that, essentially, is why I am convinced that there is no, I guess, there is no sense that integrity is not important, but it's just that Kenyans do not see leadership that espouses it, and therefore they are beginning to lose hope. But the bulk of our country, the bulk of our nation has integrity.